Thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar, Recalls, Mitigating the Risk and Managing the Process. The webinar today is being recorded and you are all on mute. Please use the questions box to ask questions during the webinar, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Our speaker today is Susan DeRagon. Susan is Senior Technical Consultant at QIMA. With over 35 years of experience, she is a leading quality and safety expert on toys, children's products, and promotional and licensed goods. She has conducted numerous technical seminars and webinars globally. She works closely with companies to provide the highest level of quality service in the areas of regulatory compliance, product testing, quality control and assurance, safety evaluations, and inspections. Please welcome Susan DeRagon.
Great, thank you, Krista, and thank everyone for joining us today. For those of you who may not be familiar with QIMA, we're a leading provider of supply chain compliance solutions, including testing, audits, inspections, and consultation. We have 25 offices globally, over 3,000 employees from 60 nationalities, and we operate in over 85 countries with on-the-ground presence. So today we're going to talk about recalls, starting with how to manage and mitigate the risk of a recall. We'll review ways to assess the potential risks that products may present and how to manage those risks. There are ways throughout the product life cycle, from concept through distribution and beyond, to reduce potential hazards and thus mitigate the risk of a recall. A robust compliance program includes these steps for managing risk. It should also include steps for managing a recall, should one be required. And so we'll review the reporting requirements and steps to help ensure you're ready for a recall. And then we'll try and leave time for Q&A at the end of this webinar. We have a lot to cover in 60 minutes, so let's get started. And we'll start with the risk assessment process, how to identify potential hazards and their associated risks. And I want to start by saying that regulatory compliance is mandatory, of course, but it's often not enough to ensure that a product is safe. As any regulator will tell you, regulatory compliance is a minimum requirement. Many recalled products comply with the applicable regulations, and yet were found to cause injury or present a hazard to consumers. Thus, the need to look beyond mandatory regulations and evaluate product for potential hazards. And that's the first step in a risk management process. And once a compliant and safe product is made, you need to take steps to ensure continued compliance and safety. If you receive the CPSC recall notices, you know that almost every day safety-related recalls are occurring. In Europe, the European Commission issues a weekly RAPEX report that lists numerous product recalls for that week. And as we all know, every consumer product has risk. Take shoes, for example. Pretty much everyone has them and knows how to use them. And yet, there are potential hazards with shoes which may result in consumer injury and even recalls. There are metal pieces that can poke through the sole, and metal rivets around shoelaces that cause lacerations, some even resulting in stitches. There are steel-toed work boots that fail to protect the user's feet. Heels can become unstable or break and cause falls. With children's shoes, you need to ensure that the toggles or any decorative pieces do not detach and present a potential choking hazard. The shoes shown here have all been recalled for one reason or another. But even if the potential or perceived risk does not result in a recall, there's social media and the saferproducts.gov website where consumers can share their concerns with a product. There are numerous complaints in this database about certain performance sneakers and people falling or otherwise becoming injured. So with any consumer product, the potential risks need to be identified and addressed. And how do we do this? An important consideration in identifying potential hazards associated with a product is to assess the human factors. Who's the intended user and the potential unintended user of the product? How will they use the product, both in the intended use and also foreseeable unintended use scenarios? Human factors is a study of how humans behave physically and psychologically in relation to particular environments and products. A human factors specialist typically has an advanced academic degree in psychology or has special training. This type of evaluation is useful, especially for new products, to assess how they may be accepted by the user for which it's been designed. In these two pictures here, it's certainly foreseeable that children will go up the slide in addition to going down it. So any hazards associated with going up the slide need to be addressed. Not really as foreseeable that someone would use a portable crate on wheels as a stroller for a child. Some of the resources that you can use to identify potential hazards are listed here. To start, you should look at the mandatory and voluntary standards globally for the product under evaluation, or if it's a unique type of product, for similar products. Existing injury and incident data, such as through the NICE database, is key to learn what is occurring with products similar to yours. A behavioral task analysis takes you through the entire use of the product and can be used to help identify potential hazards at any step. And then research can be performed to help evaluate unresolved concerns. So as mentioned, mandatory regulations are considered the minimum requirements necessary to bring a product to market. Compliance with the regulations and standards do not mean that a product is safe. When conducting a risk assessment, one should look at all regulations and standards that may be applied to the product. So this would include reviewing international standards, even if the product's being sold in the US only. The international standards may cover issues not addressed by the US standards. Europe, in particular, takes a precautionary approach to product safety, whereas the US is more reactionary. And look at industry standards that don't have the mandatory compliance of the regulations, but these may address issues such as durability and life cycle usage of a product to help identify potential hazards. And these include ASTM and ANSI standards, as well as UL, AATCC, and others. The ASTM zipper pull test may have helped avoid the recall of the pictured jacket due to zipper pull detachment, resulting in small parts choking hazard as well as laceration hazard. And you should consider whether the so-called voluntary standards are really voluntary. Just because it's not a federal regulation, it is important to note that the CPSC expects compliance when an industry standard addresses the safety of a product. The industry standards provide that additional safety factor. And one should also review and analyze existing data. Much of this involves injury and incident data of similar product or product with similar characteristics. And there are various databases available. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has the NICE database. NICE stands for National Electronic Injury Surveillance System. It's been used for over 30 years and includes data from the emergency room departments of 100 hospitals selected as a probability sample of all 5,300 plus U.S. hospitals with emergency departments. Patient information is collected from each NICE hospital for every emergency room visit involving an injury associated with a consumer product. SaferProducts.gov is a public product safety database which can provide insight into how consumers are using products and the challenges they may be facing. It's recommended that as a business, you sign up to receive immediate notice of any complaints associated with your product. And you also have the opportunity to respond to any reported complaints in this database. One can also consult available anthropometric data, such as adult data and child data, which include dimensions of pretty much every part of the body at various ages, as well as strength data. And so this helps to assess whether the intended user of a product under evaluation will be able to successfully use the product based on its size and shape. And there are human factors publications through the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, NIH, the National Institute of Health, publications and other research papers that can be used as resources. And look at the recalls. CPSC, Europe's RAPEX, Health Canada, and others. What's been happening to similar products that are resulting in them being pulled from the market? And social media is another great resource that can provide insight into how products are being used. So in addition to the external data, your current customers can give you valuable feedback to help you address any issues with current product and help you reduce these issues with future product. Customer complaints are a good source of information regarding consumers' interactions with the product. Your customer service team can gather great information based on feedback from the actual customers. Keywords such as injury, doctor, hurt can be used to help sort through the call summaries and identify potential issues. And ideally, you can get the product in question back from the consumer so you can do a forensic type of evaluation. You know, is this a one-off issue related perhaps to gross misuse, or is it an issue that could be inherent in all of the product? And look at your returns. Are there an unusual amount of returns or certain parts that require replacement? This could indicate a poor design, and this information can be used to improve future similar product. Look at online reviews of your product or similar product. Any safety-related complaints should not just be noted by customer service. There should be an escalation process for product safety-related complaints. This feedback should be shared with product designers and engineers, along with your product integrity and compliance managers. All companies should maintain a repository for incident reports and other customer feedback related to safety. You're going to need it, not just for hazard identification, but also if there are issues that could lead to a recall. What did you know and when did you know it? With the behavioral task analysis, one identifies and evaluates the steps associated with product use, from taking it out of the box and assembling the item through intended use and foreseeable misuse. How could it be cleaned and stored? Could it be misassembled but still usable? If it's not working properly, how could the consumer try to troubleshoot the problem on their own? And where and how will it be stored? With paper shredders, for example, one knows the intended use and potential issues with finger laceration if one doesn't use it properly. But how about cleaning the product? Those teeny bits of paper can be difficult to clear away completely, and there have been accidents, many explosions and fire caused by using compressed air to try and blow them away, because compressed air can contain flammable chemicals. So clear directions on how to effectively clean the product and warning against use of compressed air may be needed. With certain juicers, if assembly is not done perfectly, if the filter basket is not placed properly, it can crack or shatter and spray the user with dangerous bits of sharp plastic. Ensuring that the product would not function unless everything was properly fitted could help avoid an issue such as this. And finally, you can conduct your own research. And there are many ways of doing this dependent on your intended audience and what information you're looking for. I've been involved in behavioral observations, undirected, to see how the consumer would use the product without direction, and then also directed to see if they could do certain things with the product. Sensory panels can be used for product development as well as quality management for assessing issues such as shelf life and market acceptability. Focus groups can help one understand the motivations of the user and their perceptions of the product, its usability. And survey research is another tool to help determine how a product may be used. I've been involved in research using surveys on the effectiveness of age grading when toys are distributed free with the purchase of something else. You know, while age grading on retail products can provide guidance to the purchaser, when it's free, this research indicated that one does not pay as much attention to the labeled age. And so you want to ensure that the toy is safe, not just for its intended age. So all of these processes can help provide insight into typical consumer use and perception, and thus influence your approach to the safety of particular products. And once you've identified potential hazards, you want to document them and address them. And there are various tools that can be used, and I'm going to discuss just a few of these. A standardized checklist, whether one developed internally based on your particular product type, or a generic one available in the standards or guidelines, can help ensure A, that you're consistent in the evaluation and you're not overlooking a known potential hazard, and B, that the hazard has been properly addressed. And the excerpt here shows potential mechanical hazards as well as thermal hazards. The list goes on, obviously. And this is a hazard pattern checklist that I've used to evaluate toy premiums in particular. It's a fluid document and modified as needed based on injury and incident and recall data, but it's helpful for consistent reviews. A decision tree or fault tree analysis is a deductive method of analysis, starts at the top and works through a series of events or faults that could lead to undesirable outcomes. How may product be used? What are the potential hazards associated with that use? What is the risk associated with those hazards? And how will these risks be addressed? A decision tree can be used for each hazard that's identified. ISO Guide 51 and Europe's guidelines for non-food consumer products contain examples of decision tree diagrams. This process provides a system for deciding between several courses of action. The decision tree evaluates the risks and rewards of each option, aimed at enhancing one's decision process. And the FMEA process, failure mode and effects analysis, helps to quantify the risk associated with each potential hazard. And there are various models that can be used. Typical is a two-factor model that evaluates the probability that an injury associated with the hazard will occur and the severity of that injury. And exposure is another factor that can be considered. An injury that's unlikely to occur, but if it does cause significant injury or even death, needs to be addressed. An injury that is likely to occur but is not severe, maybe not. You know, you likely can't address every possible hazard. So being able to quantify can help with your risk assessment in determining which potential hazards need to be addressed. OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, it's a group of regulatory agencies from 21 countries, uses similar approaches. FMEA is also mentioned in CPSC's Handbook for Manufacturing Safer Consumer Products as an approach that identifies the components of a design or the function of a process and their potential consequences of a failure. In other words, this process is a systematic method for identifying the severity and likelihood of failures or injuries. So we've assessed the risks using the various tools and resources. Now, what do we do about the risks? You're probably familiar with the safety hierarchy, sometimes called the hazard control hierarchy. It's essentially a scheme for dealing with product hazards and risks. The best and most effective method is to eliminate the hazard, design it out. Do you need those decorative plastic flowers on the child's skirt? Or can you design out this potential small part choking hazard by using embroidery or another means to decorate the skirt? If it's not feasible or desirable to design out the hazard, then you should guard against the hazard. Ideally, prevent contact between user and hazard. Or using my skirt example, you could use redundant assembly, two independent methods of attachment to help ensure that the small part does not detach. And then lastly, if you're not able to design the hazard out or to adequately guard against the hazard, then warning the consumer about the hazard is the last line of defense and the least effective. So when should you design out the hazard? Going back to our FMEA discussion, a hazard should be eliminated or designed out when there's a high likelihood of the hazard occurring and or where the severity of the injury is high and where it's feasible. Baby walkers provide an excellent example of how the hazard of falling downstairs was addressed. This was a well-known hazard, highly foreseeable with potentially quite serious injuries. So walkers were modified to address this hazard by increasing the overall width of the base so that it wouldn't fit through most doorways. And there's a type of braking device should the front wheels drop over the edge of a step. There's now federal regulation that incorporates these design requirements. And the design modification also has to be technologically feasible. A knife needs to be sharp to function properly, and there may be financial considerations. So there are many instances where the hazard simply cannot be designed out. A lawnmower must have sharp blades in order to work properly, but guards can be put in place to help prevent injury to the user. In the picture shown here, both physical guards as well as procedural guards are used. So physical guards are often in the form of personal protective equipment, such as the eye protection, sturdy shoes, and long pants of this lawnmower man. The lawnmower itself has a physical guard that shields the blades. A procedural guard prevents people from coming in contact with the hazard. In the case of the lawnmower, both hands must be on the handle to activate it. When using a guard, it's critical that there be appropriate manufacturing controls to ensure that the guard is properly manufactured and assembled. These are critical processes that need to be monitored throughout production. Faulty guard means hazard is present. Another example of guarding against a hazard and the criticality of the manufacturing process is with a baby rattle. A baby rattle typically contains small beads inside to make the rattle noise. One can't really design out the small beads, but instead you have to rely on the proper manufacturing and assembly of the two halves of the rattle to ensure that the two halves don't separate. Separation would expose the small beads and present a choking hazard to infants. So with this type of guard, it's critical that the factory have proper manufacturing controls and in-process monitoring to ensure consistently compliant product that can eliminate the risk of choking on small beads. And then lastly, one can warn about the hazard. Least effective, but it certainly has its place as an important safety communication where the potential hazard cannot be effectively designed out or guarded against, and where one feels comfortable accepting the potential risk and alerting consumers to it. The warnings may be used in conjunction with the guards or on their own. Some of the warnings we see may seem like overkill, like the do not use the scrubbing bubbles for personal hygiene. There are standards such as ANSI Z535 that provide guidelines on producing an effective warning, from location and size to wording, colors, and symbols. And there are standards that include specific warnings, such as the ASTM candle warnings pictured here, and the small parts, small ball, and balloon warnings, which are codified in 16 CFR 1500.19. Important to note that even the best warnings are not 100% effective. People may not see the warning, they may ignore it, and they may not understand it. So, risk management can and should be incorporated into every step of a product life cycle. As seen here, risk management starts with the product concept and identifying and mitigating any potential hazards, then selecting the right factory. Pre-production evaluation qualifies the materials and the design. And then the production testing is typically the regulatory compliance and safety testing. Safe transportation and timely distribution of the product all factor into the happy customer with brand loyalty. So in the next few slides, we'll review these phases in a bit more detail. The product concept phase is in large part the creative process. During this time, designers develop ideas and concepts that may eventually turn into tangible products. In terms of product safety during this phase, a human factors review and hazard identification are important steps to help protect both consumers and your company. And so, as we've discussed, this type of review goes beyond the regulatory standards and tries to anticipate foreseeable use and unintended use scenarios. This type of evaluation helps identify and reduce or mitigate potential hazards early in the design phase to reduce the possibility for injury and product recall. Once the concepts are vetted, a more detailed design evaluation can be performed and a full risk assessment. So information such as the product dimensions, materials to be used, components, and assembly methods are assessed. Even the best designed product can run into issues if the wrong factory is selected to manufacture it. How can one feel confident that the product will be produced in a consistently compliant manner using fair business practices? And here, factory audits play an important role in the vendor selection process. There are many different types of audits. Some of them are listed here for your reference. An audit can evaluate the factory's manufacturing capabilities, management structure, quality control process, document control, working conditions. The factory audit may also evaluate other concerns that may impact product quality, timeliness of deliveries, and the capacity of the facility. Do they need to subcontract? A concern that factory audit can give insight into the reliability and the quality of your suppliers and the quality of the product sourced from these suppliers. For social compliance, ethical audits provide businesses with intelligence and tools that help them develop and implement sustainable business practices within their supply chain and help ensure that their products are made in a socially and ethically responsible manner without child or forced labor, and with fair wages, working hours, and acceptable conditions. In addition to audits, consider the factory's experience with your type of product. Has their product been recalled? And if so, why? Is this factory included in any of CPSC's letter of advice, which are issued for violation of a mandatory standard? These are publicly available on the CPSC website. And how financially stable are they? You need to find the right product to produce your wonderfully designed item. So now you have a safe design and you've selected an appropriate factory. And the pre-production phase is the time to vet the materials, the production techniques, and proposed final product labeling and artwork before mass production starts, and any errors become quite costly. Raw materials qualification is typically a chemical analysis of the materials that will be used in production to determine their compliance. So this testing often includes lead, phthalates, cadmium, and other heavy metals. It may include azo dyes, formaldehyde, and other testing depending on the material and the area of distribution. Research testing, or testing to failure, may be performed on mechanical or performance aspects of the product to determine not just compliance, but how far above the set limits does the product perform, and how consistent is this performance. Statistical analysis of these results, often in the form of a Z-value, may be performed. And pre-production mechanical testing of pilot or first-run product is recommended. This should include samples from each mold, cavity, and assembly line to provide confidence to go into mass production. A production readiness assessment may include a review of the factory's quality control plan for that particular product. And then the labeling verification and artwork approval, while perhaps not safety related, are still important steps in the pre-production phase. The marketing must match the age of the intended user, and age labeling may be required or recommended depending on the product. And then lastly, a confirmation based on pilot or first run product of the aesthetic and functional expectations should be performed. So during mass production, there are a number of actions that can be taken. From a testing standpoint, regulatory compliance is critical, and testing for compliance may be mandatory if it's a children's product, for example, being distributed in the US, has to be tested by a CPSC accepted third-party laboratory and certified as compliant with applicable product safety requirements. If all the upfront steps we've just discussed have been done properly, the production compliance testing really should be just a verification. And there may be other safety tests appropriate for your product. Remember that regulatory compliance does not always equal safety. And any labeled claims should be substantiated. From a quality and consumer satisfaction standpoint, testing for quality and performance, function and durability may be appropriate. And if you do find a non-compliance or any less than satisfactory result, it should undergo a formal corrective action process that identifies the root cause, the affected product, and the steps to correct that failure. Random and representative sample selection is another important part of the testing process. You want to avoid golden samples, which are samples specifically designed and selected by the manufacturer that will pass testing, may not be necessarily representative of the entire lot. So companies often have third-party inspectors go into the factory and pull random samples for testing to avoid this. And then in addition to the product testing, there are a number of audits and inspections that assess the production process to help ensure consistently compliant product. Process audits differ from the factory audits we discussed as part of the vendor selection, in that the process audit evaluates the quality controls and processes specific to the product being produced rather than the entire factory's processes. Have critical control points been identified, and are they being properly monitored? Some manufacturers have QC inspectors at the factory throughout production as part of production monitoring. Quality inspections can help companies provide quality consistent products that conform to agreed upon standards and specifications. And these can be done at various points throughout production as listed here. In general, a quality inspection will help reduce the amount of unsatisfactory product that reaches your customer, and therefore reduce product return rates and dissatisfaction. These inspections can prevent defective product from even leaving the manufacturer's facility. Inspections are really a cost-effective means to help ensure that product meets your quality standards as well as your customers prior to shipment. So, when you reach the transportation and distribution stages, there are loading inspections that can help ensure that product is safely loaded with no tampering or contamination. CTPAT compliance can help facilitate shipment, as can importer self-assessment programs. CTPAT is a voluntary supply chain security program led by CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and focused on improving the security of supply chains with respect to terrorism. The program was launched in 2001, and it currently has over 10,000 certified partners. One of the benefits of this program is that CTPAT members are considered low risk, and therefore shipments are less likely to be examined at the ports. And the last phase of a product life cycle is when it reaches the consumer. Once product is on the market or it's been distributed to the consumer, there's still activities you can do to assess the product and the effectiveness of the brand. Market surveillance testing means pulling product from store shelves and performing some type of validation testing to confirm whether the product that actually reaches consumer hands is compliant and looks and performs as intended. Large retailers often perform this type of evaluation. Vendor return analysis and failure evaluations are important for many reasons. One is that returns related to safety may indicate the need for a recall. So you need to receive this information and document it accordingly. and understanding how consumers are using your product and any issues they're having help with the concept and design reviews we discussed at the start of a product life cycle. If consumers are having difficulties with a product, you need to know about it, and you can perhaps take that into account with the next similar product. We talked about this early on as one of the ways to identify potential hazards and mitigate risks. It's the circle of life. And if there are customer returns and complaints related to product safety, there are CPSC requirements for reporting, which we're going to get into some detail shortly. Many of the recent fines levied by CPSC against certain companies were due in part to late reporting when companies had knowledge of consumer injuries with their product. And then focus groups in general can help assess how consumers feel about the product that's currently on the market. So let's touch briefly upon compliance programs. In some civil penalty settlements, the CPSC settlement agreements included provisions requiring the companies to implement and maintain a CPSC compliance program. The thought being that deficiencies in a firm's compliance program or procedures can result in product hazards or defects and/or violations of mandatory requirements. So details of the CPSC's recommended compliance program activities are listed here, not all inclusive. So while there's some debate about whether it's appropriate for the CPSC to mandate these compliance programs as part of civil penalty settlements, it's certainly a good idea for all companies to have a written compliance program, one that helps ensure safe and compliant product, as well as written corporate policies and accountabilities for ensuring compliance and appropriate reporting when safety issues do arise. Companies need to have written standards and policies, compliance training, and the means to report compliance-related concerns confidentially. And by compliance, think safety. Again, it's not just regulatory compliance, but actual product safety. Having these policies in place are expected to facilitate reporting to the CPSC when needed. You know, with any compliance program, a risk management program, such as we've just discussed, is recommended. A robust risk management program is far more than finished product testing to assess compliance. Recalls in the US and globally are a way to get unsafe product off the market and out of consumers' hands. And while nobody really wants to be involved in a recall, it's an important program. So we're going to talk now about managing the recall process. Recalls happen almost every day. There are several regulatory agencies responsible for addressing recalls based on product type and country. Health Canada focuses on recalls in Canada, and often there are joint recalls between the US and Canada. The European Commission has a system called RAPEX, the Rapid Alert System, which enables a quick exchange of information between 31 European countries and the European Commission about dangerous non-food products posing a risk to health and safety of consumers. They issue a weekly recall listing, which you can sign up to receive. The FDA recalls unsafe or violative food, drugs, cosmetics, and other products under their jurisdiction. Recalls.gov is the official U.S. government website and includes recalls from various federal agencies, the CPSC, the FDA, also the U.S. Coast Guard, NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, USDA, and the Environmental Protection Agency. So it's intended as a one-stop shop for U.S. government recalls. And we're going to focus today on CPSC recalls. The Consumer Product Safety Commission is an independent regulatory agency established in 1972 that's responsible for protecting the public from unreasonable risks associated with consumer products. The CPSC established the Consumer Product Safety Act, which gives them jurisdiction over 15,000 different types of products that could be used in a home, in schools, or in recreation. So we're going to start with the reporting requirements. There's 3 categories of reporting requirements. Sections 15 and 37 are included in the Consumer Product Safety Act, the CPSA. Section 15 is the primary reporting requirement, and we'll go into some detail on this. And Section 37 addresses reporting related to lawsuits. The Section 102 reporting requirement is part of the Child Safety Protection Act, the 1994 public law. So Section 102 of the CSPA requires reporting related to choking incidents. So Section 15 establishes reporting requirements for manufacturers, suppliers, importers, distributors, and retailers. Each is supposed to notify the Commission immediately if a product fails to meet a consumer product safety standard, if it contains a defect which could cause a hazard to the consumer, if it creates an unreasonable risk of serious injury or death, or if the product fails to comply with a voluntary standard that the Commission has relied on under the CPSA. So by enacting Section 15, Congress intended to encourage widespread reporting of potential product hazards. Reporting would also identify risks of injury that could be addressed through voluntary or mandatory standards and through information sharing and education. Reporting under Section 15 can provide the most timely and effective source of information about the product because firms often learn about potential product safety problems at an early stage. Reporting a product to the CPSC under Section 15 does not automatically mean a recall, does not automatically mean that they'll conclude that the product creates a substantial product hazard, or even that a corrective action will be necessary. The Commission will work with the reporting firm to determine what's appropriate. The company must file its report to CPSC's Office of Compliance and Field Operations. The report ideally should be filed electronically through saferproducts.gov, but it can also be filed by mail, telephone, fax, email. The company should assign the responsibility of reporting to someone who has knowledge of the product and of the reporting requirements under Section 15. He or she should have the authority to report to the CPSC or to quickly raise the reporting issue to someone who does. This process should be part of your compliance program. And reporting firms should be prepared to provide certain information. However, no company should delay a report because some of the information is not yet available. The information that needs to be included in the report is listed here. So retailers and distributors may satisfy their reporting obligations by reporting the above information. Or the retailer has the option of sending a letter to the manufacturer, the supplier, or the importer of the product describing the risk of injury or death or defect or product's failure to comply with an applicable regulation, and then they have the responsibility of reporting. Section 15 requires firms to report immediately. This means that a firm should notify the Commission within 24 hours of obtaining the information. The CPSC encourages companies to report even potential substantial product hazards, even while their own investigations are continuing. However, if a company is uncertain whether the information is reportable, the firm may spend a certain amount of time to determine if it's reportable. The investigation should not exceed 10 working days unless the firm can demonstrate that a longer amount of time is reasonable. Otherwise, the Commission will presume that the firm has received and considered all information at the end of 10 working days. And the Commission considers a company to have obtained knowledge of product safety-related information when the information is received by any employee of the firm. Once that occurs, the firm has 5 working days for the information to reach the CEO or the person assigned responsibility of the reporting requirements. Really for as long as I can remember, CPSC has said and continues to say, when in doubt, report. And the Commission will evaluate whether or when a firm should have reported. This evaluation is based on what the company actually knew about the product hazard or what a reasonable person should have known about the hazard if they'd exercised due care. A firm's expected to know what it would have known had the firm exercised due care in analyzing reports of injury, consumer complaints, or in evaluating warranty returns, reports of experts, in-house engineering analyses, and any other related information. So the CPSC does often receive requests for information that's reported under Section 15. However, they are prohibited to release the information unless a remedial action plan has been accepted in writing by the reporting firm, a complaint has been issued, or the reporting firm consents to the release. Section 15 lists criteria for determining when a product creates a substantial product hazard, and any one of these factors could mean the existence of a substantial product hazard. The pattern of defect. The defect could stem from the design, the composition, the content, the construction, the finish, or the packaging of the product, or from warnings or instructions that accompany the product. The number of defective products distributed. A single defective product could be the basis for a substantial product hazard if an injury is likely or could be serious. Alternatively, defective products posing no risk of serious injury or having very little chance of causing even a minor injury may not be considered to present a substantial product hazard. The severity of the risk and the likelihood of injury. We've talked about these. These are all factors we consider when performing any type of risk assessment. And a substantial product hazard exists when a product does not comply with an applicable consumer product safety rule, when it's in violation of a standard or regulation. Head and neck drawstrings on children's apparel is an example of a substantial product hazard, which is now regulated. And the CPSC applies a hazard priority system, which classifies the severity of the problem. The hazard priority system allows the Commission to rank the defective products. Class A hazard rating is reserved for the product defects that present a strong likelihood of death or grievous injury or illness to the consumer. And so they warrant the highest level of attention. It calls for a company to take immediate, comprehensive corrective action measures to identify the product and notify consumers and to remedy the defect. Class B hazard exists when a risk of death or grievous injury or illness is not likely to occur, but it's possible. Classifying the hazards just helps to determine if a public recall is needed as well, or if there's other remedial actions that can be appropriate. And Class C exists when the risk of serious injury or illness is not likely, but it is possible, or when moderate injury or illness is not necessarily likely, but possible. Regardless of whether a product defect is classified as Class A, B, or C, the common element is that each of these defects is considered to create a substantial product hazard that requires some type of corrective action to reduce the risk of injury. A firm that files a Section 15 report might want to use an alternative procedure that the Commission has established called the Fast Track Product Recall Program. If a company reports a potential product defect and within 21 days of filing the report implements a consumer-level voluntary recall within the CPSC, the staff won't have to make a preliminary determination that the product contains a defect. So this fast track recall program allows the Commission staff and the company to work together on a corrective action plan almost immediately, rather than spending the time and other resources to investigate the reported product. To participate in a fast-track product recall program, the company must provide all the information required for a full report, as we discussed earlier, and they have to request to participate in this program. They need to submit the proposed corrective action plan with sufficient time for the commission staff to analyze any proposed repair, replacement, or refund offer, and to evaluate all recall notice material before the announcement. Implementation of the voluntary recall must occur within 20 days of the report. Most CPSC recalls now are voluntary recalls done through this fast-track program. It helps consumers by removing potentially hazardous products from the marketplace as quickly and efficiently as possible. And again, to participate in this program, the firm has to be prepared to implement a corrective action plan. And the firm must immediately stop sale and distribution of the product. So, Section 37 is required if manufacturers of consumer products are involved in lawsuits, settled lawsuits. And so the manufacturer has to report if they have a product that's subject to at least 3 civil actions, if each suit alleges the involvement of a particular model in death or grievous injury, etc. Not common in our industry. But it is just important to know that it exists in case you're involved in any civil actions. So what type of information is required to be reported to the commission? The name and address of the manufacturer, model and model number involved in the civil action, a statement as to whether the civil action alleged grievous bodily injury or death, name of the case number. Reporting's required within 30 days after judgment or a final settlement of the last of the 3 lawsuits, and similar reporting process. And then lastly is the Section 102 reporting requirements and possible recalls. So this is referenced in the Child Safety Protection Act, and it requires companies to report certain choking incidents to the commission. A manufacturer, retailer, importer of a marble, a small ball, which is one with a diameter of 1.75 inches or less, a latex balloon, or a toy or game that contains one of these or any other small part, must report information that reasonably supports the conclusion that a child, regardless of age, choked on the small part, and that as a result of the incident, the child died, suffered serious injury, stopped breathing for any length of time, or was treated by a medical professional. So important to note that while the small parts ban applies only to items intended for children under 3 years of age, this reporting requirement applies to any child regardless of age. And the Section 102 report should include the name and address of the child who choked, the person who notified the firm of the incident, a detailed description of the incident and any resulting injuries or medical treatment, information about any changes that were made to the product or its labeling or warnings to address the risk of choking, and the details of any public notice or any other corrective action plan. As you're probably aware, there are specific warning requirements and age considerations for these types of products, balloons, marbles, small balls, and small parts. So it's critical that the appropriate warnings be included with all product that requires them, regardless of the method of distribution. And then, again, firms must file a Section 102 report within 24 hours of obtaining the information, can file the Section 102 report with the Office of Compliance and Field Operations by mail, telephone, or fax. And Section 102 reports receive the same confidentiality treatment as information submitted under Section 15 of the CPSA. So, what do you need to do to be prepared should a recall be necessary? Because remember, reporting does not necessarily mean a recall. So in order to be prepared to report under any of the sections we just talked about, 15, 37, or 102, the first step is identifying if you have a problem. It's important for companies to develop a system for maintaining and reviewing information about their products that could suggest a product defect or unreasonable risk of injury or death. And we've talked about this. It's important for companies to retain information related to product safety. Internally, this information can come from consumer complaints, product returns or parts replacement, insurance claims or payment, reports of product problems, and test reports. The customer service reps who handle customer complaints should be trained to know when to escalate a complaint that may be related to product safety. Design evaluations and risk assessments are also important tools that can help a company identify early on if there could be a potential product hazard. And monitor external resources such as saferproducts.gov and the various recall websites for any issues with products similar to yours. Register at saferproducts.gov to receive reports of harm or potential harm related to your product. CPSC expects you to be monitoring all of this. And it's important for companies to be able to identify a defect, ideally before the product reaches the consumer. But not all products that present a risk of injury are defective. The kitchen knife is a good example. The blade has to be sharp to allow the consumer to cut or slice food. The knife's cutting ability is not a product defect, even though some consumers may cut themselves while using the knife. So in determining if a risk of injury associated with a product could be a defect, there's certain things you have to consider. What's the intended use of the product? How is it supposed to be used, and how could it be misused or used in unintended ways? Who's exposed to the product? What's the intended age of the user? Are certain age groups more exposed to potential injuries than others by using the product? What type of potential injuries can the product cause? What's the need for the product? What information sheds light on the product and patterns of consumer use? Are there similar products on the market that have been recalled? And what changes in design or materials or manufacturing or packaging can be made to eliminate or reduce the potential hazards and risks? Before any incident or potential recall occurs, it's important to be prepared. You should establish a recall plan and a recall team. And again, this can be part of your compliance program. Information about recall plans can be found in CPSC's Recall Handbook, which is available online at cpsc.gov. You need to identify who's on the team and each person's roles and responsibilities. Prepare a phone calling tree consisting of stakeholders and decision makers. Create and keep updated, ready-to-go procedures, templates, and scripts to use in case of a recall. I know a lot of companies that perform mock recalls to test their recall program and identify any gaps. And if it's determined that your product presents a potential hazard, it's important to start preparing for the recall. The actions listed here are just some of the steps a company facing a product recall would need to take in close collaboration with the CPSC. Again, determine what the product defect is and what caused it. Find out where the products are, how many are in distribution, did it fail to comply with a standard, verify the severity of any product failure. You could have additional samples tested at the lab. You can do that forensic analysis we talked about before. Make sure appropriate regulatory bodies are informed about the defect or compliance issue. We've been focusing on the CPSC, but depending on the product, it may be regulated by the FDA or another U.S. agency. And if you're distributing outside of the U.S., you need to notify other countries' regulatory bodies. You need to discontinue production and shipment of the defective product. Notify all retailers, distributors, or end buyers to stop selling and distributing the product. Ask them if there's any way for them to help identify consumers who own the product. Quarantine all affected product in a secure area. Prepare a press release informing consumers of the recall and determine if any other forms of public notice are needed. We'll talk more about the communication aspect shortly. But remember that any press release for a recall needs to be prepared with assistance and approval from the CPSC or the other regulatory body, depending on the product. Establish a toll-free telephone service that will be able to handle the amount of calls expected after the call is announced. Hopefully, you created your phone scripts ahead of time with fill in the blanks for the actual recall. If not, write those scripts now for this recall. And estimate the cost of a recall campaign. And that includes labor and funding to provide replacement parts or to exchange the defective product. Prepare how you'll monitor the product recall. You have to provide timely reports to the CPSC on the progress of a recall. And lastly, quality control and risk analysis procedures should be established, or if they already exist, upgraded to help prevent similar product recalls from happening in the future. These are just some of the administrative and operational functions that a company involved with a product recall will need to be addressed. And again, primary objective of a recall is to locate all defective product as quickly as possible. The defective product should be removed from the distribution chain and from the possession of consumers to avoid further risk or harm. And the purpose of a recall is to provide accurate and understandable information to the public about the product defect, the hazard, and the corrective action. The company should design a plan that motivates people to respond to the recall and to take the recommended action. In determining how to notify the public, a consideration is the level of hazard that the product presents. As we discussed, that those Class A hazards warrant the highest level of attention. And other considerations can include where and how the product was marketed, the user population, and the life of the product. And there's several ways that companies can communicate recall information to the public. This is not an all-inclusive list, just some common examples. There will likely be a joint news release from the CPSC and the company. Those of us who are signed up for the CPSC notices receive these pretty much on a daily basis. The joint news release should include that dedicated toll-free number for consumers to contact to respond to the recall notice. A video news release can be issued to complement the written news release. And in addition to written and video news releases, radio announcements can be broadcast. Depending on where the product is sold, recall posters are sometimes used to announce the recall and tell consumers what to do. Recall information should be posted to the company websites, and not just the website of the recalling company, but of everyone involved, whether it's a retail store or supplier, distributor. You can notify trade associations and newsletter services to help publicize the recall, and use your company's social media sites, YouTube or Facebook or Twitter or Pinterest, etc. Wherever you promoted the product, you can also use that to inform consumers of the recall of the product. Don't try and hide it. It's all about getting the word out. And lastly, you should have some incentive to consumers to help motivate them to return the product. And this could be in the form of a monetary refund, it could be gift cards, it could be premiums or coupons, anything to encourage the consumers to return the product. And while the company issuing the recall has some flexibility in how they want to present the information to consumers, there is certain information that must be included depending on the type of press release you're issuing. And these are listed here. News releases, written and video, has to include the information listed here. In the event of a recall, how will your company retrieve, repair, and or replace the products already in consumers' hands, as well as those in the distribution chain? This is another important part of product recall preparedness. Prepare by developing a plan to address how your company would determine a suitable remedy. Ensure that your replacement item is safe if that's the remedy you choose to go to. How you're going to deliver the remedy in a timely manner, and document that these remedies are delivered. You need to segregate recalled product from non-recall items that may also be returned by consumers. And you have to establish a returned product disposition strategy. You may be able to rework the product, or you may need to destroy the product or recycle it. And the CPSC requires certain documents and data to be included in reports submitted to them. And it's also good business practice to compile and retain records for your internal operational reasons and also for legal reasons. So maintaining accurate records about the design, the production, and distribution of each product for the entire life cycle is important for a company when conducting an effective recall. And so you should maintain, at a minimum, all of the information listed here. And lastly, just want to summarize what should be included in a company's product recall manual, which again may be a section of your overall compliance program. Every company should have one, a recall manual and a compliance program. And the recall manual must include most of what we've discussed today. First, you have to be prepared. Again, recalls happen nearly every day. You have an obligation to respond immediately. So develop a solid and detailed recall plan, as we've discussed. You have to monitor the market using saferproducts.gov, news media, social media. However, to learn how consumer products have been used and if they've been recalled. You should develop a system for maintaining and reviewing information, and this should be documented in your manual. And the manual should include procedures for reporting information to the CPSC, including designating a recall coordinator who's granted full authority to take the steps necessary to initiate and implement all recalls with the approval and support of the CEO. You know, as mentioned, a recall team should already be in place with the roles and responsibilities of each team member clearly identified. The recall procedure in the product recall manual should outline the steps needed to manage the recall of a product deemed to be defective, unsafe, and are otherwise subject to regulatory action. There are 4 steps to a recall process, and details of each should be included in your product recall manual. The product evaluation occurs when information suggesting a problem is received. The recall coordinator may make an initial evaluation, bring in the recall team, and just evaluate and determine if they feel a recall is necessary, or at a minimum if reporting is necessary. And so factors, again, consider the product itself, its intended use, the defect, the risk, the location and quantity of potentially unsafe product. And then you move on to communications, including with the regulators as needed. Should a recall be required, you need to identify the affected product. And product removal is the last step. And this procedure can be divided into 5 components. You have removal, control and disposition of the affected product, recall effectiveness, and recall termination. A termination of the recall process may be considered after all reasonable efforts have been made to remove the affected product from commerce, including reconciliation, recall effectiveness, and disposition. It does end. It's important to remember that a recall is not the end of the world. It doesn't mean that the company did anything wrong. The recall process is a positive one and allows companies to get unsafe product out of consumers' hands. How well a company conducts a recall can influence a consumer's attitude about that company. So be prepared. Hopefully you won't need to use your product recall manual and all the procedures you put into place. Implementing the risk management processes we discussed at the beginning of this webinar and having a robust compliance program in place will help lower the need for a recall. But if you do need one, by following the steps that we just discussed, you should be ready. Listed here are some of the available resources to monitor recalls. Sign up to receive these automatically. It's valuable information from a risk assessment standpoint to mitigate potential hazards and to understand just the types of products that are being recalled and why. And I just want to end by saying that QIMA is here to help you every step of the way throughout your product life cycle. I'm afraid I've run over time, so I'm not sure we have time to do any questions now, but please submit them and we will be sure to respond. Krista?
Yes, thank you very much, Sue. QIMA would like to thank everyone who joined today. The recording of this webinar will be emailed to everyone tomorrow. We hope you join us again for our future webinars and have a great day. Thank you.